Why do we still see shoes that are hung on power lines? If you're like me, you've always associated those hanging shoes with the movie Like Mike, or the not-so-safe neighborhood that you used to live in. One popular theory suggests that they mark gang territory, or symbolize a particular spot where one could buy illicit substances. In reality, though, law enforcement and historians have found no consistent evidence that shoe throwing was ever a reliable gang symbol. Different gangs in different cities used different marks, and hanging shoes on power lines weren't one of them. So where did this actually come from? The earliest documented cases appear in the 1950s and 60s, mostly in the United States. One common reason was the rite of passage. Soldiers finished basic training, kids graduating school, or teens marking the end of childhood would toss their old shoes over the wire as a symbolic goodbye. Another real origin is bullying and pranks. Shoes were thrown over the wire to embarrass somebody, especially in school neighborhoods, leaving them shoeless and humiliated. In some communities, the shoes became an informal memorial. Friends would hang a pair of their buddies' shoes if they passed away or moved away, turning the power line into an accidental landmark of memory. Over time, the meaning blurred. What started off as, perhaps pranks, milestones and personal symbols turned into kind of an urban folklore. Now, most shoes that are hanging on a wire don't mean anything specific. They're just copies of copies. People repeating something they've seen before. Today, the hanging shoes are less of a symbol and more of a mystery. A quiet reminder of how everyday actions can turn into legends, even when the truth is far simpler. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Did you know that chainsaws were originally made to help with childbirth? Today, chainsaws are associated with lumberjacks tearing through massive forests. But surprisingly, the first chainsaws weren't made for cutting wood at all. They were invented for surgery. In the late 1700s, Scottish doctors John Aitkins and James Jeffrey developed a small hand-cranked saw designed for medical procedures. At the time, sometimes surgeons needed to widen the pelvis during complicated childbirth, in a procedure they called symphysiotomy. Traditional tools at the time were slow and dangerous, so doctors created a device with a tiny chain of serrated teeth that could cut bone more quickly and more precisely. These early chainsaws looked nothing like the gas-powered machines that we know today. They were small, handheld instruments that surgeons rotated by hand. It wasn't until the early 1900s that engineers adapted the same tooth-cutting mechanism to cutting timber. Once it was powered by a motor, the tool became widely effective for logging, and the modern chainsaw was born. So next time you see a chainsaw cutting through a tree, remember, the technology behind it actually started in a hospital operating room more than 200 years ago. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Have you ever wondered why there's so much air in chip bags? It might seem like a ripoff, but that air actually serves a purpose. What's inside the chip bags isn't regular air. It's actually nitrogen gas. Food companies started using nitrogen mid-1900s because it protected the chips from going stale. Normal air contains oxygen, which causes the oils in the chips to oxidize and turn rancid. Nitrogen, on the other hand, is an inert gas that keeps chips fresh and crunchy for way longer. But that puffed up bag does something else too. It acts like a protective cushion. During shipping, chips get tossed around in trucks and warehouses. Without that extra space and gas buffer, most bags would arrive as crushed crumbs. So the next time you open up that bag of chips and see air, it's not there to cheat you. It's there to keep the chips fresh and prevent them from turning into potato dust. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Why are so many taxis painted yellow? It actually goes back to a clever marketing idea in the 1900s, Chicago. A business named John D. Hertz, who later founded the Yellow Cab Company, wanted his taxis to stand out in a crowded city street. But instead of just picking a random color, Hertz consulted a study from the University of Chicago that tested which colors people could spot the fastest from a distance. The answer? Bright yellow. Although that could be argued with another story that I had done on colors and why red is the most prominent color. Check that story out if you're interested. So in 1915, Hertz painted his entire fleet bright yellow. The idea worked perfectly. Yellow taxis were easier to see, easier to hail, and quickly became associated with taxi service itself. Soon, other cities adopted the look, and the bright yellow cab became an urban icon, especially in places like New York City. So the reason why taxis are yellow aren't random at all. It was simply the color that people could spot the fastest. And one smart businessman turned it into a worldwide symbol for transportation. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Spill the beans. When someone tells you to spill the beans, they're asking for the truth. But this phrase started over 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece. Back then, people didn't vote with paper. They voted with beans. White beans meant yes, dark beans meant no. And each vote was dropped secretly into a jar. If that jar spilled over during the voting process and spilled the beans, the result would be instantly revealed. The secret was out, accidentally exposing information before it's known. So every time you use that phrase, you're repeating a piece of ancient democracy, one spilled secret at a time. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Have you ever said, "I'm feeling under the weather today," when you're feeling a little sick? And have you then wondered, where did that originate? This phrase comes to us from the age of sailing, especially in the 18th and early 19th century. Life at sea was brutal, and weather wasn't just bad. It was dangerous. When storms rolled in, sailors who were already sick or injured often went below deck, literally placed under the weather to protect them from wind, rain, and the crashing waves. The phrase appeared in written records as early as the 1820s, used almost exclusively in maritime context. Over time, it drifted ashore. People who had never stepped foot on a ship began using it to describe feeling weak, off, ill, even though the original storm was long gone. What makes the phrase stick is how accurate it feels. Just like those sailors, when we're sick, we want rest to get out of the storm. So next time you say you're feeling under the weather, you're unknowingly echoing centuries of sailing. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. We all know the pinky promise to be the ultimate childhood oath. Break it, and you're basically a villain. But this tiny gesture has ancient and surprisingly serious roots. The tradition traces back to Japan, where it was called yubikiri, literally meaning finger cutting. Breaking a promise wasn't just embarrassing, it could mean punishment. The idea was symbolic. If you break your word, you'd lose a finger. A concept that still echoes today in the Yakuza practice of finger cutting as atonement. The pinky itself was chosen because it's the weakest finger, representing vulnerability and trust. When two people hooked pinkies, it symbolized that their honor is now tied together. Break the promise and you break the bond. The gesture made its way to the West in the 20th century through Japanese cultural exchange, eventually softening into the playful but very meaningful promise kids still use today. So next time someone asks you for a pinky promise, remember, it may look harmless now, but it started off as a vow you literally did not want to break. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Going cold turkey. When someone says they quit something cold turkey, it sounds almost funny, but the origin of the phrase is anything but. The expression comes from the earliest 20th century America, and it's directly tied to drug and alcohol withdrawal. Doctors and journalists noticed that people abruptly quitting substances like opioids, morphine, or alcohol often developed pale, clammy skin with goosebumps, a texture that looked eerily like raw plucked turkey skin. The earliest recorded use appeared in the 1920s, a 1921 newspaper article describing addicts who quit drugs suddenly without tapering and having to go cold turkey. The cold part referred both to the sudden stop and the physical sweats that came with withdrawal. Unlike gradual treatment methods, quitting cold turkey meant no medical help and no easing off, just stopping entirely, and often with brutal consequences. Over time, the phrase spread beyond addiction and became a casual way to describe quitting anything abruptly. Smoking, sugar, social media, you name it. So while today it's tossed around lightly, going cold turkey started as a grim medical description rooted in the harsh reality of early addiction, and a reminder that some phrases carry on darker histories than they let on. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. Today, crossing your fingers is a quick way to wish good luck, but the tradition actually goes back hundreds of years, and it originally involved two people, not just one. In the early Christian Europe, the cross was considered to be a very powerful symbol of protection. People believed that crossing two fingers, forming the shape of a cross, could help call on good fortune and even ward off evil spirits. Sometimes, literally two people crossed their index fingers together while making a wish, creating the symbol in between each other. Over time, the ritual became simpler. Instead of needing two people, individuals started crossing their own fingers to create the shape of a cross themselves. By the 19th century, the gesture had widely spread in Europe and America as a symbol for hoping for good luck or success. So when you cross your fingers today, you're unknowingly repeating a tradition that began centuries ago, one rooted in a belief that a shape could bring you good luck and fortune. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories. The very true history behind the word slave. Imagine a single word that carries thousands of years of horrific ideology and suffering. The English word slave didn't originally mean forced labor by somebody who has no choice. In fact, it comes from a name of people. During the early Middle Ages, many people that were captured and sold into bondage in Europe came from Slavic regions of Eastern Europe. Because these captives were so commonly traded in slave markets, the Latin word sclavus gradually became associated with enslaved person rather than an ethnic identity. The name itself comes from Slavs, a large group of people across Eastern Europe. Over time, sclavus spread through medieval language. It became esclave in Old French and eventually slave in English. The linguistic shift happened roughly in the 9th and 13th century when the slave trading network operated across Europe and the Mediterranean. Merchants, including traders from places like the Byzantine Empire and the Venetian Republic, were deeply involved in these markets. By the time the word entered English in the Middle Ages, its original ethnic meaning had faded. Slave had become a general term for a person held as property. So the word we use today is actually a historical echo of a time when the entire populations, especially Slavic peoples, were targeted in the slave trading system. It's a reminder that language often preserves traces of history, even when the original story behind a word has been long forgotten. Like, comment, and sub for more interesting stories.